From Asia Society Switzerland, this is State of Asia. In this podcast, we are bringing you engaging conversations with leading minds on issues that shape Asia and affect us all. I'm your host, Nico Lofsinger. Today we want to do something a little bit different.
Food, of course, plays a major role in any culture around the world, and that's true for Asia as well. Some might say even more so there than in other places. And so today I want to talk about the state of Chinese cuisine in particular, and I'm delighted to welcome for this conversation none other than Fuchsia Dunlop.
Fuchsia is a cook and food writer specializing in Chinese cuisine. She was the first Westerner to train as a chef at the Sichuan Institute of Higher Cuisine and has spent much of the last 2 decades exploring China and its food. She's the author of several award-winning books and a contributor to the Financial Times, The New Yorker, and many other publications. Her latest book is Invitation to a Banquet, a fascinating 400-page read on the history and culture of Chinese food. Fuchsia has also been a guest here at Asia Society Switzerland last year, and we'll link to a recording of that conversation in the show notes.
Fuchsia, welcome to the State of Asia podcast.
Hello.
One very dominant theme in conversations about China is always change, because arguably no other country has changed as quickly over the last decades as China. And so a question that I love asking people who have lived in China for longer and have observed the country closely is what actually hasn't changed over all that time? And one answer that always comes up is the food. But I actually assume that some things have changed. So let's maybe start here. Over the last 20 years since you've been observing Chinese food and cuisine, what are some of the things that you have seen changed?
Well, so many things. It's hard to know where to begin. The whole food scene has got very commercial and very competitive with the sort of relaunch of a market economy. And the standards of restaurant service and presentation have been transformed. When I was first there, many restaurants had that sort of rather stale feel with, very old-fashioned decor and rather notoriously poor service and so on. And that's all changed very much. There's also been a great period of cultural exchange among Chinese regions, I think starting in the 90s with Sichuan restaurants opening branches all over the country. And now, for example, in Chengdu, so when I was a student there, this is in the 1990s, most of the restaurants served something that was recognizably Sichuanese food. And now you can go out for Thai food, Japanese, pizza. So it's become much more diverse. And there are many new ingredients that have come from abroad, very conspicuously, for one example, okra, which was not in evidence anywhere and is now on every trendy restaurant menu, cooked in Chinese ways. But then there have also been lots of really negative changes, like very rapid urbanization has claimed as its victims lots of the neighborhood markets, which were one of the highlights of sort of street life when I was a student. There are more supermarkets and fewer fresh markets. And I think also there's just a decline in domestic cooking skills. So the older generation in China, the sort of parents and grandparents when I was a student there, there were many of them very accomplished cooks, and they could also make their own pickles, they could cure their own winter sausages and meats, and they cooked from scratch practically every day. But these days, there's such pressure on young people to study that many of them are not really learning how to cook. And of course, now there's this, in one sense, glorious availability of takeout food. I mean, you can get anything delivered to your door very quickly. But it's just that I think younger people are conspicuously not learning from their parents these kitchen skills. And I think that's a real shame, because that was one of the things that most impressed me when I lived in Sichuan.
Are there also specifically Chinese food trends that you're observing? A certain style of cooking or a certain dish is kind of gaining dramatically in popularity and then maybe also disappearing again? Have you observed things like this?
Oh, constantly. I mean, China is a really food-obsessed country and culture, and so there are always new trends. One thing that was very noticeable when I was on my last trip earlier this year was that people were talking about Fujian and going to these towns like Quanzhou on holiday, and then also talking about Fujianese food. And that's something that wasn't really on the tip of anyone's tongue 20 years ago. And also a trend, a slightly negative change for what they call yuzhi cai, which means dishes that are pre-prepared in central kitchens and then simply reheated or finished in restaurants. And that was something that everyone was talking about earlier this year. And again, a huge change from the old days, 20 or 30 years ago when every restaurant was cooking everything from scratch. And also, one thing that was totally surprising to me and rather hilarious was that if you stay in a hotel these days, you can get your takeaways delivered to your room by robot, which was something that I haven't seen in Europe so far.
Obviously, Chinese cuisine is somewhat of a misnomer. There is no such thing as Chinese cuisine. It's way too large and diverse of a country to have like one style of cuisine. And so there are different ways that we can classify Chinese cuisine by region, by province, Sichuanese cuisine versus Cantonese cuisine versus Hunanese cuisine. Then of course you have the north-south distinction, the rice versus wheat. Is there a classification or a structure that you would apply sort of to the entirety of Chinese cuisine that you find particularly helpful?
Yeah, well, as you say, there are lots of very contentious different systems for classification. There is no hard and fast way of doing that, of course, because cuisines don't have boundaries. And they don't have national boundaries either, because, for example, Yunnan province, the culinary styles in the south and west of Yunnan just melt naturally into the culinary traditions of Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, with lots of cross border similarities. And the same in northern China with Central Asia. But within China, I think that you could just drive yourself crazy arguing about where to draw the distinctions and which places merit individual consideration. But personally, I find the four great cuisines to be really helpful as a guide because that draws your attention to, firstly, the major difference that you just mentioned between the wheat eating north and the rice eating south. And there are other sort of broad things that you can say about North and South, like in the North, they tend to favor sort of bold garlic and vinegary seasonings. They have not only wheat as a staple, all kinds of breads and dumplings and noodles, but more cold weather crops. And in the South, it's rice based and in the north also they eat a lot of mutton and lamb, and in the south it's pork and duck, poultry very important, and lots of fish as well as rice. Great biodiversity, many fresh vegetables. And then the east and west is another interesting sort of cultural distinction because that would sort of showcase the difference between the very hearty, boldly seasoned, spicy cooking of Sichuan, which is flag bearer of Western Chinese cooking, and the very delicate flavors, beautiful watery foods. So not just fish and seafood, but lots of water vegetables like water chestnuts and also freshwater crabs and water bamboo, all these really interesting plant and animal foods. But also the Jiangnan region, so that's the region sort of inland from Shanghai, including Shanghai, was the historical headquarters of Chinese gastronomical writing. So many of the sort of famous literary poems and the cookbooks, many of them came from this region. So I think if you think of these four great regions, the sort of dumplings and noodles of the north, the spice of Sichuan, the delicate literary cuisine of the east, and then, for example, Cantonese with its seafood and wonderful fresh vegetables and so on, and delicate light flavors in the south, then it expresses something of the radical diversity of Chinese cuisine and the fact that the differences in different regions of China are as great as the differences between, Northern European countries and Southern European countries. So for me, that's a very useful guide. And as long as you remember that it's a simplification, just as saying Chinese cuisine at all is a simplification.
I was recently at a dinner here in Switzerland, and part of the dinner was a larger Chinese delegation. And the restaurant, undoubtedly wanting to show off sort of local cuisine, started with a creamy soup. I think it was cauliflower at the beginning, and then a famous Swiss dish involving potatoes, meat, mushroom, and cream. And then for dessert, they like a huge slice of apple strudel with vanilla sauce. And as I was like eating my way through this very, very heavy meal, I was sort of thinking of how you often talk about like harmony and balance in Chinese cooking, which very clearly was lacking in this meal. It was good, but it was just so heavy. I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit how Chinese cuisine achieves this balance, and maybe why, in your view, Chinese cuisine has been better at this than maybe some other cuisines.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the big irony is that so many people in, America and Britain, and I don't know whether it's in Switzerland the case too, but when people think of Chinese food, they think of quite inexpensive takeaway food, and they don't think it's healthy. There's a stereotype that Chinese food, it's all sort of sweet and sour and deep fried food and fried rice, and it's not very healthy. And this is the most terrible misunderstanding about what Chinese food is all about, because of course that style of Western Chinese takeaway food, it's very tasty, but it's not really representative of what most Chinese people still eat at home all over the country. And as you say, the idea of balance. For the Chinese, food and medicine have been thoroughly intertwined, really since the beginnings of Chinese culture and civilization. The earliest Chinese written recipes were actually medical prescriptions for dishes that with tonic properties. And food has been seen as the foundation of good health for more than 2,000 years. As you and anyone who has Chinese friends will know, Chinese people typically talk about food and health just constantly and almost unconsciously. You know, they change what they eat according to how they're feeling or the season or the weather. Your diet is how you respond to how you are, and it's how you create and maintain good health. And so this idea of balance is that, so it's partly about health. So if you have a very heavy meaty dish, you'll always have, you know, a light vegetable dish as well. And typically a meal will be served with a fairly plain and understated staple food, whether it's just steamed rice in the south or steamed buns in the north. The strong dishes tend to be balanced, and the meaty dishes with a lot of vegetables. Like in England, we often, if you go out to a restaurant or you have a special meal, the vegetable dishes sometimes seem like an afterthought. They're just small side dishes, and it's not that people take particularly trouble with flavoring them or making them appealing. They're just something on the side. Whereas in China, vegetable cookery is also pays great attention to taste and pleasure and so on. But also there's an aesthetic component, because a well-planned Chinese menu should be balanced in all senses. So you want a good balance, for example, of colors. So if you have one dark red braised pork coloured with a lot of soy sauce, then you probably want something that's a nice vibrant green or a different colour so that the table looks lively. If you're cooking a very pale ingredient, like slices of fish, you might brighten it up by adding a few slices of red and green pepper for colour. There's also a balance between different cooking methods. So if you have something that's dry and deep fried, then you'll want something that's soupy. You know, steamed dishes will balance stir-fried dishes. Also, the way food is cut. So if you have something that is cut into cubes, maybe the next dish will be cut into slivers. So the idea is that you have this very appealing and a pleasing harmony and variety. So you don't want to repeat the same ingredient in more than one dishes. And the idea is that variety is what makes food palatable as well as healthy. It's one of the great pleasures of Chinese cuisine. And it's one of the reasons why one of the terrible and hilarious Chinese stereotypes about Western food is that it's 很简单,很单调, which means very simple and monotonous. And I can't tell you how many Chinese people have said that about Western food, which they, you know, often talk about as if it was one cuisine, like we talk about Chinese food.
Well, it's glad to know that there's stereotypes on both sides. The kind of balance that you talk about is also somewhat easier to achieve if you have a variety of dishes that you can prepare, and maybe you're cooking for a larger group. It's definitely been my experience, you know, even when invited at someone's home for Chinese food, this is going to be like an impossibly large amount of dishes. And my assumption is that a person has spent the better part of their day preparing all of this. So, you know, talked about people cooking less at home because there's also, you know, the more pressures just of studying or of working. Translate this and assume, you know, you're a Chinese family, you have jobs, you have kids, you kind of come home at like 7 p.m. and then you need to have dinner ready in 30 minutes. Like, how are you doing like different slices and cooking methods and dishes in like this half hour, right? So there has to be a different approach to that challenge for sort of like weekday family cooking.
Of course, it's reduced compared with a banquet or a special meal for friends. But actually, Chinese cooking can be quite quick and handy if you have a few basic techniques. So, for example, you could just stir fry some beaten egg with a couple of tomatoes to make one dish of beautiful colors, and stir fry another green vegetable and have the rice cooking in the rice cooker. And that's a basic meal which will be tasty and colorful and varied and nutritionally balanced. balanced, which really doesn't take any time at all. I mean, so I think there are ways of cooking, and also, in traditional Chinese cooking, there are shortcuts. So you might buy some tasty relishes made from, in Sichuan, for example, pickled vegetables or tofu that's been tossed in chili oil and spices. So you can pick them up at your market with your fresh vegetables. Or roast meats that people often buy in, like Cantonese char siu and roast duck. People don't make these things at home. So you can buy some things in and serve them with home cooked vegetables and steamed rice that you steamed at home. So I think Chinese cooking doesn't have to be so complicated. And also just something that I often cook at home, just a simple working lunch. So a bowl full of noodles. So if you have some stock in the freezer and then you just boil some dried noodles or noodles from the freezer, have a little bit of a leftover meat stew, you put that on top, you slice some spring onions for color, maybe you have some pickles on the side, a bit of chili. And already you've got a beautiful variety of colors, some fresh things, some, some meaty things. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It's more a sort of approach that you can tailor to your circumstances and how much time you have available.
I just want to say we're recording this around like 5 p.m. Switzerland time, and I feel like I have to go now and make one of these for dinner. I love egg and tomatoes and rice. It sounds fantastic. One aspect of Chinese cuisine that you also discuss in the book is the idea of meat as a condiment. So of using meat products not as like a central component of a dish, but more as a tool for flavoring, for adding depth and maybe lusciousness to a dish. Talk a little bit about how that exactly works. It seems like a very clever idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just that until quite recently, many Chinese people ate mainly vegetables because that's, all they could afford to do. And so in ancient China, one name for the rich was 肉食者, meat eaters. They were the people who ate meat. And other people were living on grains and vegetables. Until very recent memory, people couldn't afford to eat much meat. And so Chinese cuisine just structurally and stylistically is particularly suited to making meat go further, mainly because for about 2,000 years, people in China have been in the habit of cutting food into small pieces and eating it with chopsticks. And what, of course, that does is it means that you can take ingredients, you can cut them small, and you can combine them to make a variety of dishes. Lin Yutang, that great interpreter of Chinese culture for Western audiences, said something like that, Chinese cuisine was fundamentally about the art of mixture. In that context, a piece of meat that, a steak that would feed one American or Brit, in Chinese cuisine, you quite naturally would cut it into fine slivers. And if you do that, then you can stir fry it with something like celery or Chinese chives or one of any number of vegetables, cut harmoniously into the same sorts of slices or slivers. And you make a very appealing dish, which is tasty, but which serves more people. It can appear on the table with other vegetable or meat dishes and serve a whole family. So it's partly about the way the food is prepared, cut into small pieces. Also about the idea hun su da pei, which means that you should balance meat and vegetables, so often in a single dish. And also just traditional Chinese cooking technique is a lot about creating umami flavors by adding a little bit of something tasty to another ingredient that is a little blander. So, for example, you might use dried shrimps when you're cooking winter melon, which is a very delicately flavored vegetable. And by using dried shrimps, you give it the kind of robust, satisfying, rounded flavor that you get in a more meaty dish. And Chinese people do that with all kinds of, using a little bit of lard, a little bit of cured pork or sausage, or slivers of actual meat or stock to cook vegetable dishes. There's a way of saying which is su cai hun zuo, which means vegetable dishes cooked meatily. So you get some of the pleasure of eating meat without actually using a lot of meat. And that's one of the things that I think makes Chinese food as a sort of style of eating incredibly relevant these days, because we all have to find ways of eating less meat or we are going to destroy the planet. And the great thing about Chinese cuisine is that, I find, and I know a lot of readers of my cookbooks have told me they found, if you cook in a Chinese way, you quite naturally can find yourself eating less meat without feeling that you're sacrificing something. Because the Chinese are very, very good at creating flavor with vegetables. And of course, one should say that the irony of this whole conversation is that these days, the Chinese, now they can afford it. And with this kind of excitement after a period of not having enough meat, are going crazy for eating meat and eating more than they ever have done. And it is, as I'm sure you know, the Chinese growing demand for meat, which is one of the big environmental stresses that we face. And of course, from a Chinese point of view, they're just catching up with the gluttony of other countries. But collectively, I feel that the rest of us and the Chinese themselves could look more to the traditional Chinese diet as a model of more sustainable eating and also of more healthy eating, because of course there are health benefits to eating less meat. I mean, I find it very inspiring because it is this extremely food obsessed culture where people have placed a great premium on not just healthy eating, but on eating for pleasure and of combining health and pleasure and of making, for example, even Buddhist vegetarian cooking, which is supposed to be about restraint. You can have tremendous banquets of entirely plant-based food, often resembling meat and fish. So I just think, and for me, it's just this joyfulness about food and brilliant culinary technique, which you can actually couple with eating in a more restrained way without losing the fun and the joy of it.
One of the truly most mind-blowing facts that I've learned from your writing is about fermenting beans, which is something that is incredibly central to Chinese cuisine and East Asian cuisine in general, but it's also virtually unknown in the West. And that's remarkable because historically, of course, Europeans had beans and they knew how to ferment things. They fermented a great many type of things, from beer to cheese to bread, yet they did not ferment beans. So why is bean fermentation so essential in Chinese cuisine? And do you have any theories on why the Europeans just never thought of doing that?
Well, as you say, it goes back to very ancient times. So in the Han Dynasty, again, sort of around 2000 years ago, the fermented black beans that you can still find in any Chinese supermarket were being made and traded in China. So they have a very long history. The way that you ferment beans is a bit different from the way you ferment other ingredients in the West because of the use of koji as a method, or qu as it's known in Chinese. So it's the use of these molds which combine enzymes and yeasts and mold and fungi to convert starches and so on into this wonderful range of flavors. And so particularly the soybean, which was first domesticated in China perhaps about 3,000 years ago, and which is a desperately unappealing ingredient in its raw state. You know, it takes a lot of cooking just to make it edible, and it's still a bit smelly and actually in some ways anti-digestible because some chemicals in it. So it wasn't a very appealing ingredient. But when the Chinese discovered how to ferment it, they unlocked this extraordinary source of plant protein and all these delicious flavors, which again helped to make vegetarian food more palatable because you have that fullness of flavor that I think a lot of people enjoy getting from meat. They became very important in Chinese food very early on, and then at some point, it's not clear exactly when, they also discovered how to grind the beans into so-called milk and coagulate it to make tofu. And that was becoming a very popular and well-known product, about 1,000 years ago. And so that then became a source of protein that you could then cook like meat. So the whole question about why the Chinese did and Europeans didn't, I mean, the soybean was sort of native to China and not to the West. And in fact, it didn't come to the West until very late on, and was initially just used for sort of, I think, animal food and oil, as it still is mostly in the West. The key thing here may well be dairy products, because in the West, dairy foods were very important. Pasture land, rearing cattle and eating dairy foods. And of course, they provide a lot of the same nutrition and protein as soy milk does and soybeans. Whereas in China, there are different theories as to why the Chinese didn't take to dairy products. One is that they were keen to draw a cultural distinction between the Chinese and the nomad so-called barbarians who lived beyond the Great Wall and used to sometimes come and invade, and who had a very different lifestyle. So they were pastoralists and they relied on meat and dairy foods. So that's a sort of cultural argument. But also, of course, the soybean ended up offering much of the same nutrition. So, that may be another explanation, that they just had this alternative source of protein and flavor. And it had huge implications for the Chinese diet and making a more vegetarian inclined diet very palatable, and also for the Chinese landscape, because in most of China you don't have pasture lands. But it is really interesting that fermented beans have just not been explored in the West at all until kind of yesterday.
You also write a lot about how we, as in the West, the Europeans, deeply misunderstand Chinese food. Do you see parallels between how we misunderstand the cuisine and maybe the culture and the country in general?
Well, I think they're very connected. For example, Chinese food in the West was kind of created by Cantonese immigrants to America from the 19th century onwards. A lot of them went from the Cantonese South, many of them quite poor farmers. They went in the gold rush, they worked on the railroads, and later they faced not only racial discrimination, but actually legal, officially sanctioned discrimination in the form of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which made it almost impossible for Chinese people to immigrate anymore. And they were sort of forced into the catering trade and the laundry trade for lack of other opportunities. And there's always been this sort of negativity about, from that time about Chinese and about Chinese food. And I think so it's always been very connected with racial prejudice and with ignorance about what Chinese people really do eat. And part of that with Chinese food, so there were economic reasons, the situation from which Chinese prejudice grew in 19th century America. And also there are language challenges because, of course, Chinese is a very different language. And it's actually, when it comes to food, it's very difficult to express some concepts and terms in English because we don't have equivalent vocabulary. There have been all these stereotypes about Chinese food which have grown out of misunderstanding, like the idea that it's unhealthy because people are judging it by a particular style of inexpensive takeout food. The idea that the Chinese eat everything, which is certainly true to an extent, because the Chinese are joyful and adventurous eaters and they eat many different ingredients that other cultures don't. But the fact that this has been seen so negatively, I think, is really just about prejudice. So yes, you can say that the two are connected. And I think that was really shown during the COVID pandemic, when these sort of fears about the origins of virus in China, did it come from some terrible wild animal stall at a market, led to this huge prejudice against Chinese people, in America, in Britain, which was out of all proportion to the actual matter at hand. And it just sort of revealed very uncomfortably some kind of latent prejudice which was there and which was actually connected with the food. I think one of the problems now with all these geopolitical tensions is that there is less travel, fewer Westerners are going to China, living there and working there, and that's not encouraging understanding. And it's like the more differences we have, the more crucially important it is that we try to understand each other. Food is it's many people's entry into understanding China. It's many Westerners' first encounter with China, and it's a really good way in because it reveals so much about China and Chinese culture. The reason that people have all these negative stereotypes about Chinese food is because they don't know what it's really like. They don't really have an experience of it. And you could argue the same about China. People are making judgments on very limited information.
You've been writing about food for a really long time, and it always seemed to me that writing about food, whether it's about the cooking part or the eating out part, is incredibly hard to do well without sort of drifting into cliches. You do it wonderfully, and one great hallmark is that I think whenever I read something that you've written about Chinese food, it just makes me hungry. But I wanted to ask, sort of as someone who's been doing this for so long, what for you makes a good food writer?
I think that it's not in a sense different from any other kind of writing in that you want to write with real observation and integrity, and you want to really notice things when you eat something, to really consider it and to think about the context. And I think also to be very honest, so not to make things up. Try and do it with some integrity and with thoughtfully. And the other thing is that I feel that sometimes when I go to China, often in fact, Chinese people say, "Oh, why have you come to China?" And I say, "I've come to China to eat." And they think I'm joking, but I'm not really joking, because I feel that, I really tried to educate myself through eating and to understand food as a sensory experience as well as a cultural and an intellectual experience. And it's all of those things, really.
Excellent. Fuchsia Dunlop, thank you so much for having been on State of Asia.
Thank you.
I'm now joined by my colleagues Serena Young and Remco Tonis, as always, to discuss the conversation I just had with Fuchsia Dunlop. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello.
I should start by saying that we're having this conversation in a conference room, and there's literally like zero food in the room.
I have cookies.
Remco has cookies. Beyond the cookies, Remco, what did you make of the conversation with Fuchsia?
Well, I'm no foodie, but hearing her talk about the contagious joy and adventurousness of the attitude a lot of people in China, according to her, have towards food, made me almost interested in food. Almost. Yeah, it needs a bit more, but no, it made me feel bad that when I was living in Shanghai, I sometimes went to this restaurant called Grandmother's, and one of my go-to dishes was the tomato egg soup, which they called the Laowai soup, the soup that dull foreigners got, because they never walked outside of the comfortable paths of the dishes they knew and the ingredients they knew. After hearing this conversation you had, Nico, with Fuchsia, yeah, I kind of regret, and I should next time I'm there maybe be a bit more joyous and adventurous in my culinary exploits.
On the contrary to Remco, I am of course a foodie, as probably every other member of our team qualifies, I would say. And I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. So I think what stuck with me was quite right at the end, her approach to food as an education tool that really speaks to me, and how she phrases that is just like focuses me and gives me legitimacy to go further down that road.
It's just so much harder to write or speak about food well, in a sense, that it conveys what you want to say and it's engaging, but it's also devoid of stereotypes than it is to write or speak about geopolitics, which is of course what we do here most of the time. So I've just so much respect for the way Fuchsia does that. The one quote that stuck with me is that in China, your diet is how you respond to how you are. This is not something you would say about at least the Western food cultures that I'm somewhat familiar with. Of course, you have comfort food and you would sort of eat some soul food if you feel down, but I think in Chinese cuisine, this connection in sort of between how you feel and sort of what that means for what you eat just seems to be much stronger.
One similarity to Swiss cuisine is about meat as a condiment. So I've heard of a Swiss butcher claiming that bacon is just a condiment. So I think it's not too far off. What I really enjoyed is how she explained the balance. And it was almost like a guessing game. So when she said, if you have this and that, and in my head, I was trying to guess what she was saying and what you would pair that one dish with. And I think I was always right, but it was really entertaining.
Yeah, I hooked on that balance aspect of the conversation as well, where, especially because, and that she does that great, like she has fans, of course, in Europe, in America, but also in China. And she just manages in a fantastic way in this conversation, and apparently with her new book as well, which you have read, Nico, I have not yet, to bridge cultures and these societies through Chinese cuisine, and using that balance, saying, well, one steak that can feed one Brit or one American goes a lot further in Chinese cooking. And also the vegetable, which is usually an afterthought, she mentioned in British cuisine, but I think that goes the same for most European cuisines. There you can really make it a full ingredient of your meal. And I always thought of that when traveling in Asia, and I was flying a lot, and in the airplane I always would ask for the Indian vegetarian meal. And it was just so much better than what my neighbor got, who just got the spaghetti bolognese from the microwave or something. Yeah, if you really pay attention to those vegetables and the balance with the spices and everything, vegetables are just so much more than the afterthought next to a nice juicy steak or whatever.
I think we're unfair to at least some European cuisines if we say that vegetables are just an afterthought. I think the Italians and the Spanish and generally the whole Mediterranean region may object to that. What I do think is in there is that, and again, it's something she said, in China, cooking is essentially the art of mixture. That's an actual key difference where we see Western cuisine sort of evolving into separate components of a dish, right? You have the meat component and the vegetable component and sort of the starch component and sort of this very sort of traditional kind of setup. But I think in China then you have a much stronger tendency to basically mix things, right? Because that's one of the dominant ways of cooking things would be to slice it thinly and stir fry it. And so you end up with a lot more dishes where the meat and vegetable is combined. And I think that then sort of helps to basically transport textures or flavors from the meat to the vegetables. Fuchsia referred to this as vegetable dishes cooked meatily. And I think that again is something that there are great vegetable dishes in other food cultures, I would struggle to think of a lot of sort of European dishes that are vegetable dishes, but quote unquote cooked meatily.
She also mentioned that in relation to the food and diet and health part, the first recipes were actually like prescriptions, right? And then that keeps you thinking about recipes in general. Are there some kind of translation? It makes sense to me as someone who ran a pop-up restaurant for a week, which I don't recommend, but it involves so much measuring, right? And you're just calculating constantly and trying to make use of the produce that you have. I like the thought of a recipe being some kind of translation. And what Fuchsia really excellently does is some kind of cultural translation, right? She gives context and observations that really let you dive into Chinese cuisine. I mean, one dish that involves all of these points that we've talked about is mapo tofu, which a lot of times, if you take people out for this dish or cook it for them here in Switzerland, for example, they're really surprised that there's tofu, which is the signifier of vegetarian food here. It's just combined with minced pork. Also, the texture is really different to what we have, right?
Maybe we can end this, since we were talking about mapo tofu, by me reading you a very short passage from Fuchsia's book where she describes mapo tofu. And I think it's also a really good example of just how incredibly good her writing is. So I'm quoting from the book. Who really can resist Mrs. Chen's creation? Mrs. Chen is the person who invented mapo tofu. Those quiveringly soft cubes of tofu in a luscious braise of punchy chili bean paste, fermented soybeans, garlic and ginger, with a few morsels of minced beef and a final scattering of ground Sichuan pepper that plays jazz on your lips. No one in their right mind could accuse this tofu dish of being bland and uninspiring. Even habitual meat eaters like my father lap it up. And that's all for this episode. If this has made you curious and hungry, I highly recommend you pick up one of Fuchsia's books. Her latest one is called Invitation to a Banquet, and I've been very much enjoying reading it. This is the last episode airing before our State of Asia conference. On the next episode, we will bring you a recording of the State of Asia address delivered by Singaporean diplomat Bilahari Kausikan. If you are in Zurich on November 21st, you can also come and listen to the address live at the University of Zurich. Registration is free and open to the public. More information is in the show notes. There you will also find links to all our upcoming events and programs, as well as information on how to support our work. If you enjoy this podcast, we appreciate if you can subscribe and leave a rating or review. It really helps. The State of Asia podcast is produced by Remco Tanes. My name is Nico Luchsinger. Thank you so much for listening.